Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I am excited as I can be to introduce our guest to you. Before I do, I want to thank a few people that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com. The mighty Quinn Brass and Winds are where we at the Willow School go when we're looking for brass and woodwind instruments. And if you're looking for brass or woodwind, we suggest you give them a call. Mighty Quinn Brass and Winds. You are watching Truer MU, the truth about music, where we go a little deeper into music, into the questions that people ask, and try to go somewhere that we haven't been before. And to that end, I want to introduce our guest to you. But before I do, there's a story, as there often is. Many of you who watch this show know that I attended Georgia State University, and I was very happy there. I had a wonderful education. I was not in the jazz program, although I did study jazz with my teacher, Dr. Hayden. And one of the best experiences of my time there was spending a year with the GSU Jazz Orchestra under the direction of Dr. Gordon Vernick. I have known him for a long time. I don't see him as often as I would like. However, I wanted to take this opportunity to have a conversation with him, and I thought the show would be an ideal place. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Vernick. Dr. Gordon Vernick is a professor of music and a coordinator of jazz studies at GSU. He has performed with world-renowned artists including Kenny Werner, Claire Fisher, Randy Brecker, and many others. In addition to his frequent work as a soloist and clinician, he serves as the director of the Rialto Youth Jazz Orchestra and the musical director of the Rialto Jazz for Kids Middle School Jazz Outreach Program. Dr. Vernick, it's great to see you again. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. So I don't actually know that much about your history. What I do know is that your dad was a musician in New York City and you are from there. One of the things I'm really curious about is when you first became interested in music, when you first became interested in jazz, and if those two things happened at the same time.
I growing up in a musical house. My father was a professional bassist, but he was trained as a violinist in the 1930s when he was very young. He studied at what later became known as Juilliard Conservatory. So he had a very good, European classical conservatory training. But at the same time he was doing that, he was also learning how to play the double bass and the tuba because anybody who played a violin played double bass, and if you played double bass, you ended up playing tuba and a marching band. So he had a pretty good background. And we grew up. We lived on Riverside Drive, which is northern part of Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River. And he was a professional musician. So my earliest recollections of him are he wasn't home because he was out playing gigs. But occasionally he would take me on jobs or with him when I guess my mother was busy, so someone has to watch the children. But I had great interaction and experience with his friends, musician friends, and also hearing them play. And one of the things that really struck me was the joy that they seem to derive from playing music and the camaraderie. I think that was maybe I didn't know much about music, but I could just tell that they were having a good time and they were laughing and joking. But sometimes it'd be very very serious. But that to me that was very attractive. And so I went to middle school and high school in Rye, New York, which is about 30 minutes, 35 minutes north on I-95. So we weren't that far out of New York City. We would still go into Manhattan quite often. And then I was in fourth grade, they had an instrumental music program, and I wanted to play the saxophone. That was the instrument that I was most attracted to. It was shiny, they could play a lot of notes, and it was exciting. And so when they got to my name, they did it alphabetically. They were giving out, the band director was giving out instruments. She says, "Okay, well, young man, what would you like to play?" And I said, "Saxophone," because my last name begins with a V. She looked back behind her and she said, "Well, you don't have any more saxophones. Would a trumpet be okay?" And I was like, "Oh, that's fine."
Yeah.
So I ended up with a trumpet. But even to this day, a lot of the times when I'm thinking about melodies or playing, I'm almost singing saxophone kinds of lines. I was attracted to the flexibility and the acrobatic nature of woodwind instruments, but played on a trumpet was very special. So I started like most kids in elementary school with band class, and then I eventually learned how to play. But I knew about classical music, and I had been raised around jazz and pop music. So to me, there was no difference. It wasn't like one is different. I could just, when I was in band, I played that kind of music. And then listening to pop music. You know, the Beatles were very popular, and of course, at that time in the mid and early 60s, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass were incredibly popular, and so was a great trumpet player by the name of Al Hurt. Al Hurt was a big influence. He had a big, beautiful sound, and I didn't really care for the song so much, but I loved his playing. And of course, you know, hearing friends of my father, great trumpet players, and that introduced me to Doc Severinsen and Clark Terry and Maynard Ferguson. Then I found out about, you know, Miles Davis, and I was attracted to the feeling and the camaraderie. And when I would play band music, I would feel a certain way, but when I got into a jazz band or was trying to kind of improvise and play jazzy kind of music, it made me feel differently rhythmically and inside, and I was more attracted to that. But going up through a traditional, elementary school, middle school, and high school band and orchestra, you get larger doses of that than you do in the jazz band.
So you, what I'm hearing is that you basically were exposed to professional level music at an early age. So a lot of people, I think, I assume you were born in the 50s, and a lot of people born in the 50s, the Beatles hit them pretty hard, and everybody wanted to be in a garage band, and they all wanted to be in the Beatles. You seem to have escaped that fate. Is that because you had already been around musicians all the time, and it was just a different thing
Well,
for you?
that's a very good question, Adam, or observation. Your parents like a certain kind of music, and as a child, you're a young adolescent, you're trying to establish your own set of rules and goals and things that you like, and they often don't really mix well with what your parents think is music, or their concept of popular music. You know, he liked jazz. Um, and that was the kind of music, or jazz-based music, that comes out of the 20s, 30s, the big band swing, Sinatra, all that stuff that came out of the 50s. And then, of course, rock and roll began to, make inroads into popular music by the mid 50s. And then there was, surf music, and then R&B and doo-wop. And the Beatles really changed a lot of things in terms of popular music. And I remember in 1967, he was down in Manhattan doing some business, and he came home, and he had this big cardboard box under his arm, and he says, "Wait till you see what I have." I said, "What is that?" And he says, "Oh, you'll see." And he opens his cardboard box, and it was an electric bass. And I thought, oh, my dad's going to be a rock and roll musician. No, he wasn't. It was just at that time, most people who played double bass had to kind of switch over, because as popular music was changing, the repertoire had to change. So I thought that was the coolest thing. But I still respected and liked that music, but I also liked the kind of music that I like. And of course, I would bring home certain records, and I might put it on and say, "Oh, Dad, check this out. This is really great." And he'd say, "Well, that's really awful," or he'd say, "Oh, that's pretty good." I remember playing certain things, Cream, for instance, with the Disraeli Gears record, and he first didn't like the sound, then he heard Jack Bruce playing the bass, and he goes, "That guy can play." And then Ginger Baker, he says, "Yeah, he sounds jazzy." And then Eric Clapton could, so he liked that, but the standards were very high. So once I got that stamp of approval, I knew that I was listening to the right thing. But there were other things that I brought home that they didn't, not that they didn't approve of, but they didn't really care for, because it didn't come out of that particular DNA mold of music, that cauldron that comes out of, when jazz was the popular music. I'm talking about 30s and 40s, even through the 50s and 60s, jazz was still very popular. But as we move through the 70s and 80s, as younger people are moving further and further away from that DNA, it becomes more foreign to them. So when I told him I wanted to become a musician, I was getting ready, thinking about going to college. He said, "You're not going to be able to do what I did." And what he was saying was that the music business, that kind of music, was no longer the bread and butter of workaday musicians, and jazz was changing. And he was absolutely right. He could see the writing on the walls when in those days, every musician had a little date book that was about this big, and they would go down to the clearinghouse for jobs, which was a Roseland Ballroom down I think it was on 48th Street, New York City. And they would go from group to group, little cliques, and they would go to the classical musicians, the orchestral people, the ethnic guys, the jazz guys, the studio people, and they would, with their books, they would write stuff down, and he would come home with 40 or 50 dates for the next 2 weeks. And that's disappeared. That doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
I have those books when he passed away. My mother had them. I said, "Can I have them?" She said, "Sure." And I looked on the ones from the 50s and early 60s. And what I always do, I look at my birthday. I wanted to see if my dad was home. And that day, that particular day in May, he had like 3 jobs. So that's why I grew up the way I did.
Yeah. Well, before we talk more about your relationship with the trumpet, I want to help the audience understand a little about something you said. Not everybody knows the difference between the way saxophones play and the way trumpets play. Can you articulate a little bit the difference about the if you are a trumpet player, if you're interested in sax lines, how that
Sure.
approach is going to be hard?
Well, the trumpet is a very physical instrument, and for us to deal with what's called a harmonic series, it, it's it it's um, it's it takes more musculature. Now, all the instruments are very challenging, but for a trumpet player, it's like doing like weightlifting, where playing a saxophone or flute is more like being an ice skater. You can float. They're not so worried about getting from this point to this point because we have to like figure out where those notes are, and so it's rather awkward. Um, so when I play trumpet line, when I'm playing the trumpet, sometimes I'm thinking about saxophone. So I'll play like very fast lines, kind of fluid things in it, and I'm really thinking more like a saxophone player. I mean, trumpet players started playing like saxophone players probably in the late 30s into the 40s in the bebop era when Charlie Parker would play the saxophone. Dizzy Gillespie could play the trumpet very exactly the same way, and that became the new norm for trumpet players to be able to play saxophonistic lines. Now, I don't always do that. The trumpet has certain beautiful characteristics, and so does the saxophone, flute, and clarinet, but they're more, I would say, more fleet-footed and can change direction and do all things where the trumpet players are a little more, they're they're stuck this way with this dealing with this harmonic series. And of course a trombone has its own inherent beauty, but it has its own inherent problems because there's no valves or keys. They're actually moving the slide in and out, playing across the harmonic series. So each instrument has its own things that it does really well. Again, woodwinds, like ice skater, figure skaters, brass, much more regimented. And but I still hear lines. Um, I keep my trumpet. I'm always have my trumpet. So the trumpet, the saxophone. That's a more of kind of a saxophonistic line as opposed to a trumpet. That kind of more regiment. That was kind of like a classical, like a almost like a military style.
Would you do that again with the mute? I think that you've blasted out the Zoom. We didn't hear most of those notes.
Oh, okay. Hold on, I have one right here. Oh, I have one. Oh, here's one. I'm so sorry about that. And that's another thing with the trumpet, it's directional.
Yeah.
A saxophone and woodwinds are not directional. In other words, the sound comes at you. With a woodwind instrument, the sound comes out of every hole. So that's why, clarinet players really don't have to play into a microphone. They put the microphone halfway down the instrument.
Yeah.
So a trumpet. Is that okay? Can you hear that?
Most of it. Yeah, we got most
And
of it.
then the saxophone. That's
Yeah.
kind of a saxophonistic line. So I think along those lines, even though I'm playing an instrument that is inherently not made to do that, but you hear great trumpet players that have amazing technique. And but there's a certain beauty to the trumpet, a sound that is instantly recognizable that cannot be captured or imitated by any other instrument. So we have to balance this technique with the beautiful bravura sound of the instrument. If you hear Louis Armstrong, he's a perfect example of someone with a great bravura sound. And then each successive generation raises the bar in terms of the technique and their range and the things that they can do. So now the things that we do now were unheard of 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Do you in order to be as good as that, you obviously have to have a pretty good practice ethic, and you do. You practice a lot still today.
Mhm.
Did you have that practice ethic when you were in elementary or high school? Were you pretty diligent?
No, most kids don't. Um, and I had to work on that. And when you're not sounding very good on an instrument, it's hard to find the the energy and the to move forward. It doesn't sound great, but I had very good role models with recordings, and then hearing my father's friends play, and they would always give me, hints. And then by the time I was in seventh and eighth grade, I started playing quite well, and then I started moving up, and I became known as the kid who plays the trumpet and plays in the band and the orchestra. And you get a few awards, and you think you're pretty good. Then you go to the next county over that has some kind of district or all state or all county, and then you realize that you're not as good as you thought you were. You're sitting next to someone who can really play, and but that was always an eye-opening experience. And it also didn't make me depressed. It just made me realize I had to work harder. But in order to get good on any instrument, you have to know how to practice. And one of the problems, one of the weaknesses in music education, especially instrumental music education, is that they don't teach kids how to practice. They don't teach them how to get better. They say, here's a trumpet, go do this and do that. And most kids, they don't know how to practice. That's a secret of getting better at anything. There's a wonderful book called The Talent Code. One of my mentors, Bobby Shue, insisted I read the book, and finally I bought the book, and it was like, this is it. It's about identifying, isolating, and repeating. Identify, isolate, and repeat. And that's the way football players, golfers, tennis players, surgeons, musicians, they're all doing different skills, but the process is very similar. And no one taught that when I was starting. And they just said, here, just do it and practice it, and you'll get it. Just practice it. But you have to know what and how to practice and for how long, and when it's time to leave something and go on to something else. That's what I spend a lot of time with my students, and that was never taught. And I still, to this day, I don't think it's taught unless someone is taking private lessons with a really good instructor that understands the process of how to get better. And that's why a lot of kids quit. That's why they quit baseball. That's why they quit sports. That's why they quit whatever it is, because they're not getting better, because they don't know how to get better. I'm
I
a real firm believer in that.
So a little more detail. Identify what? Isolate what?
Absolutely. It's usually a problem is two or three notes. It's not a whole line. So people try to play from the beginning to the end, and that's like stuffing a whole steak in your mouth. You can't do that. You have to cut it into bite-sized pieces. So you play through a piece of music and realize, well, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. Then you have to identify what is the problem. For a trumpet player, it's going to be one of four things. It's either going to be flexibility. I can't get from this note to this note without cracking and sounding terrible. I have to be able to articulate clearly, tongue the note clearly. Could be an articulation problem. Could be a dexterity problem. It could be a sound issue. Could be I'm not liking my sound, or it could be one of those things, or all four of them. Usually, it's a combination. So you have to figure out what is the problem, and the problem is usually three or four notes. And then what I do with my students is I say, okay, well, let's master those three or four notes, and then let's transpose them up by half steps. So at the same time we're doing that, we're working on developing our ears, and that also plays into working on improvisation, because you have to be able to play things, as you know, in many different keys as we're improvising. It's not only in the key of C. So without them really knowing, we're learning about transposition. We're learning about how to take one idea here and then do it over here, because you hear that even the greatest musicians, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, they had a set of Charlie Parker, a set of ideas that they would often refer back to, but they could play them in any permutation, in any key. And I'm trying to I don't tell the students that, but that's what really the ultimate goal is, to be able to play anything in any key, or any permutation. And that's what improvisation is. But jazz improvisation is different, because it's also about how you play the notes. Jazz musicians don't have a monopoly on improvisation. Anyone can improvise, but if you're using what's called a quote unquote jazz style, which there are certain components that we can actually identify, we put those together, then we have jazz trumpet player, jazz saxophone, jazz pianist, jazz violin, whatever it is, because jazz is not a concrete thing. It's a way to play. So if you put those things together, then you have a Charlie Parker, then you have a Bill Evans, then you have an Oscar Peterson, have put all these things together in a language that, and it made me feel so good to be able to sing and along with these recordings and then try to play. I was terrible. I couldn't do it. And then it took, I didn't, again, no one told me what I needed to be doing in order to be able to do that. And little by little, I taught myself. Then I was around some very good teachers and mentors that opened the door and then showed me how to get better. And it's a constant challenge. It never stops. As I said, I'm in one of my offices here, and I keep a trumpet here all the time. And I pick up my horn, I practice, and I'm always working on stuff. And that's one of the nice things about music is that in sports, you kind of reach a peak at about 30-ish years old, depending on the sport. And then it's downhill. With music, you can keep on going through your 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s and keep working and getting better.
Yeah. You talked about a lot of things. I was wondering, let's go back to your story a little bit. Was college a big shift for you, or was it just more the same
Yes,
path?
it was a big shift because now you're in a situation where you're not the best kid in the band. You're not the best one in the orchestra. You're not the kid who plays in the jazz group. I remember in high school, I went to the All-State. I was in New York. I was selected for All-State band, it was unbelievable that the musicians, and they had a little jazz group there. And I'll never forget this. There was a kid sitting on a piano, just playing jazz on a trumpet. And I said, God, how do you do that? That sounds amazing. He said, well, I play along with records. That's what my father would tell me. Of course, your father tells you one thing and you like do just the opposite. And I remember the kid's name is Steve Frankovich, who went on to have a very successful career as a wonderful trumpet player. Um, that was an epiphany. That was in high school. And then when I got to college, I heard trumpet players who could play way up high register, could improvise, and people who really took their music seriously. So that if I showed up to rehearsal and was unprepared, the trombone players would turn around and look at me like, come on, what's going on? There were no excuses. So the bar is raised. I still didn't know how to practice. So you learn more from your failures than you do your successes. So I would practice something to the point where I thought I had it, and then would go to play in a performance, and it wasn't what I was expecting, what I had really wanted, and I had to figure out what didn't work. I went to play this, and my fingers got all jumbly. Then I got nervous, and then I couldn't breathe, and then it just fell off the road. Um, and then little by little, I figured out, well, I didn't practice it to a deep enough level where I could play it without thinking. I was trying to play too many things. I should have played fewer notes. I shouldn't have tried to do this. You kind of learn your limitations and play within those, but you always are experimenting. Um, so that college was a real epiphany, and I was learning how to practice and become a better musician. But like most kids in that period, I was fooling around a lot. I was probably spending more time doing other things, extracurricular things than on my trumpet. And so that slowed my development down until I got into graduate school. Then I really got serious about it. I went to University of Miami, and then at that place they were mostly professional musicians in college. And then that was a real eye-opening experience because then we were expected to really perform, and there were no excuses. So that's when my true professional career started at that point in Miami. When people started to hire me, and I realized I had to know this repertoire, I had to be able to do this, I had to be able to read and be able to fit into any musical situation, which wasn't a problem, growing up in a musical household.
Yeah. I'm very fond of the way you play. I think you're a terrific player.
Oh,
And of course, had you chose, you could have gone on to a career as simply a performing musician. Although your dad warned you weren't going to be able to necessarily do that. Was education always in the cards for you, or did there come a time when you shifted over? Because you're definitely a teacher at heart.
well, I will tell you, after I did my student teaching as an undergraduate, I realized I didn't want to become a band director because I wasn't interested in marching band. I didn't want to do all those things. I wanted to play the trumpet. I wanted to be to teach, but I didn't want to do that kind of regimented teaching. But I also did a master's degree in music education while I was at University of Miami. So I got to play with some of the greatest musicians. Plus, I was learning more about administration and things. And plus, I was around really good teachers in college that I had one mentor in college. His name was Steve Brown. Steve is alive and well, and he lives in Ithaca. And he was the epitome of what I wanted to be. It was a young guy, a bachelor, had a sports car, had a nice bachelor house on the outside outskirts of Ithaca, and he dressed well, and he was an amazing musician. It was just I would look at him and say, "That's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. I want to be like that person so I could play my music as a jazz musician and not worry about marching band and work with students and teach them about the history of the music, conduct a group, play. And so in the back of my mind, I knew that somewhere that was going to happen. And he was a big influence. And of course, the teachers that I had at University of Miami, they were all professional musicians. So I could see that there's how successful they were. So I knew I didn't want to do institutional public school teaching. So when I got to finish my master's degree, I played professionally for 6 years. That's all I did. Worked on cruise ships. I traveled. I worked at resorts. Played shows. I just for 6 years, I was a workaday trumpet player until I was about 30-ish. And then I could see the writing on the walls that I don't want to wake up when I'm 45 and be looking at my date book and worry that I don't have a Saturday night wedding. And I didn't really care for playing weddings. I mean, music is an art form, but it's also a form of entertainment. And a lot of the stuff that I was doing was basically, kind of dance music, background music. And I thought, I'd rather be more like an artist where people actually sit down and listen to what you have to say as a musician. So that's when I went back to, I realized that I called one of my I called my undergraduate trumpet teacher and I told him what I wanted to do. He said, "You're going to have to get a doctorate if you want to do college teaching." I knew I wanted to do college teaching. And I went back and I took off 2 years and got a doctorate at the University of Northern Colorado, where I did jazz. I did in classical and orchestral trumpet. So it gave me a really good background. The teachers there were fantastic. And I got a job right out of a graduate school, and haven't looked back since. So, but I knew that I was going to do something as a teacher and a mentor. Now, teaching is not something that people are born with that. They're not natural born teachers. I mean, some can be very good at an early age, but I think as you mature and you leave your ego at the door, because the ego gets in the way of teaching, and it's my way or the highway. You can't. That's not effective teaching. So I had to learn how to become a better teacher, to be more patient, to understand the process of identify, isolate, and repeat. And whether I'm rehearsing my own trumpet playing, or I'm working with a college or high school or middle school band, I approach practice the same way. There's a problem right there. What's the problem? It's a saxophone note. Oh, okay, let's fix that. Let's play those three notes over and over slowly. Now we call double tap. Instead of playing da dee da, play da da dee dee da 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 da, which slows the process down. But we're also working on articulation, and then we can learn how to play a piece of music within a reasonable amount of time. That if a student was working on it at home, it would take them 3 weeks. I can do it in 12 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of teaching that I was interested in. And of course, being able to play and tour and do all those other things that college teaching does afford a professor.
You you've talked a lot about some good things that jazz educators do. Maybe you could be a little more specific. What do you think makes a good jazz educator?
Um, the most important thing is understanding how the language, how it works. And you can't learn this in a book. I often talk to my graduate students in my jazz pedagogy class, and I say, the most important, if you want to learn how to speak French, you want to go to French 101 and read out of books, or you want to go to Paris for 2 months. You go to Paris for 2 months because you don't know what you're listening to, but you're repeating and you're hearing these sounds. So that's the most important thing that a jazz educator has to be able to impart that to their students. And they also have to be able to demonstrate to a certain degree, because this is rote teaching. It's not book. It's not book teaching. This is not in a book. Louis Armstrong never went to school to study. Charlie Parker never went to school to study. Miles Davis essentially went to Juilliard just to meet Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. So this is not something you can learn out of a book. So that's the most important thing for any jazz educators to understand how the language works, and it's really about the elasticity of the notes. If you it's an African American approach to music, an African approach to music, African American approach to music that you don't find in European music. You don't find that elasticity, that stretching, and it's not being behind the beat. It's like you're stretching the beat, but this beat is still steady, and that is the most difficult thing to teach. And a good jazz educator can um, verbalize how that works and demonstrate either with an instrument or their voice, and have the students sing back, sing back, sing back. And if you can sing it proper and with proper inflection, you can play it. And I've been able to make amazing progress in just a few minutes with kids. But then they have to go home and practice it, and they have to listen to that kind of music again. If a child is bilingual, it's because parents are speaking two languages. They're not going to school. They just hear this and they repeat and they imitate. So it's a pretty easy thing when you look at it that way. It's about listening and repeating. So a good jazz educator has to have that. Then you have to know history. Then you also have to know how improvisation works. You have to be able to execute all your major scales, minor scales, arpeggios. People always ask me, well, what do you practice? Scales and arpeggios. Why would I? Those are the building blocks of Western music. All Western music is based on scales, traditional traditional harmony, functional harmony. There's music that is non-functional, but you still have to be able to execute these wide intervals, and it's all based on scales and broken arpeggios. So and then being able to lead through example. That, I think a music teacher needs to be a good musician. You don't have to be a working practicing musician, but you need to be able to demonstrate. And if you can't demonstrate, how are the kids going to know what a proper clarinet sound is, what a proper trombone sound is, if you can't demonstrate? Well, nowadays we have these giant screens where you can plug in and say, here's the Boston Brass. Check out the way these people are playing, or so and so. That's really helpful, but it's still not the same thing as your teacher saying, picking up the horn, saying, this is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's an important thing. So when I'm teaching, my trumpet is always on a music stand right near where I am. I did workshops in Spain back in March, and they were struggling with something, whatever it was. And I said, my Spanish is not good. I picked up the horn, I played it, and they go, oh, there it is. Okay, now you play it. Now, can you sing it? I'm going to play it. You sing it. We're back and forth. Bam, bam, bam. After about 20 minutes, you start to sound pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And you have to you have to be fast. You have to be able to, a good teacher has to be able to diagnose a problem, identify a problem, and have 5 solutions immediately. This doesn't work. This might work. Let's try this. There's always solutions. That's what a good teacher does. It's like going to a doctor. You just I got this. The old joke says, well, if it hurts when I do this, well, then don't do that. But you have to be able to diagnose musical problems and come up with solutions. That's what a really good instructor does.